Hattie. I was born Hattie Friedman in Chicago in 1894. But when I was just an infant, Father said to Mother, I think it's time we move to Wausau. I heard Wausau's a fine place to raise a family. And that is exactly what we did. And we came up and we moved in an apartment above my other grandparents, the Feldmans, not to be confused with the Friedmans. My grandfather was a peddler, and he would load up the carts or the sleighs and go out into the lumber camps and sell goods. Sometimes he would trade with the Indians. And then it was only natural that my father would become a merchant as well. And when we were here, my parents had a set of twins. And when they were just 1 year old, the maid took the boys out for a carriage ride, and I don't know what happened. The maid denied anything. But when they came back, one of my brothers had a concussion and died. Later, my other twin brother would die during World War I. And when I was just 11, my father died. I had a lot of death in my life. But I also had a very good life. I attended Wausau High, and after high school, I was employed by Mr. Winkleman. Now, Mr. Winkleman was a Jewish merchant. He had a very fine department store in downtown Wausau. You might know it as Washington Square. But he was a very kind man, and I had gone to Chicago for the weekend. And when I came back, there was a new floor manager by the name of Bert Zeff. And when I walked into work that day, Bert looked at me and he said, "Look what the wind blew in." That was me. And so our eyes locked. We dated for 6 months, and 6 months later, we were married. Now, Bert and I had a very good life. We had 2 children, Jack and Irene. Bert continued working for Mr. Winkleman, but he had a dream. He said, "Hattie, I've always wanted to open up my own boys' shop. What do you think about that?" And I said, "Bert, if you have that dream, then it's time that we make that happen." And so we opened up a shop at 312 Jefferson Street. And this was called Zeff's Boys Shop. And this is one of our little jackets. And that was in the 20s. At the time, we were living in a fine house at 830 Fulton Street. It was a fine house with a nice wraparound porch. I'd stayed home and took care of the children. I would do a lot of reading out on that porch. I'd go to the Wausau library and check out books, and if it was a good month, Bert would say, "Why don't you go to Janke booksellers and buy a book this month?" And so that was a good thing to do, and we did a lot of reading out on the porch. But if you were paying attention what happened in history class, you know that the Depression came, and we lost both the boys' shop and our house. But Mr. Winkleman was very kind and said that Bert could come back to work for Mr. Winkleman, and that is what he did until Bert died. At my early age of 41, Bert passed away, so I had seen a lot of death in my family. So then Mr. Winkleman employed me because I needed to take care of myself. I lived in a lot of different places in Wausau, but my final apartment was at 511 Franklin Street. You might know it as the Rosenberry Inn. It was a boarding house at the time, and I was in room 3. So I never had a lot of money along the way. Sometimes I even lived with my mother. But then I worked for Mr. Winkleman until 1965. And in 1975, the children said, "Mother, it's time for you to leave Wausau and come live with us." So I spent my summers with Irene in Chicago and my winters with Jack in California until I passed at the age of 91. But I did come back to my final resting ground here in Wausau because it was my favorite place to be.
Thank you. Thank you. You did a nice job.
Teacher.